Mr. Mack-Poole, 3 Minute History, The Fall of the Soviet Union, Part 2.
So why did the Soviet Union collapse? Well, I actually have to, unfortunately, apportion some of the blame to Gorbachev himself. And that's because he introduced radical new reforms to the Soviet Union, which hastened its own demise. One of Gorbachev's reforms was called glasnost. This translates roughly as transparency. And what this really allowed in the Soviet Union was a degree of freedom of speech which hadn't been enjoyed before. This really was a key turning point in the history of the Soviet Union. So, whereas writers such as Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which criticised gulags and labour camps in the USSR, whereas writings like that had been banned, they were now allowed. And so criticism of the Soviet regime heightened. Also, Gorbachev passed through perestroika. Perestroika basically allowed a restructuring of the economy, and this gave an open market to the Soviet Union which hadn't existed before, especially in the field of automobiles. Mechanics were allowed to start up new businesses, were allowed to keep profits. This hadn't occurred before. Now, this doesn't sound like a big deal if you're from a Western capitalist country, but this was a major shift in policy, and it made the citizens of the Soviet Union really think, well, this capitalism stuff isn't so bad, perhaps we should have it. Another key reason was nationalism. Now, nationalism was much more popular in the Soviet Union than it had ever been before, and Boris Yeltsin was a massive symptom of this. So, the former Soviet Union would span 15 countries today, countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and of course Russia. And Boris Yeltsin was a major reason for the fall of the Soviet Union. He was really campaigning for its demise. Certainly, Gorbachev blames Boris Yeltsin for the end of the Soviet Union in his autobiography. A short-term cause for the demise of the Soviet Union was that there was a coup against Gorbachev in 1991, led by Gennady Yanayev. It was unsuccessful because people like Boris Yeltsin came out and campaigned against it, and the Russian people simply didn't want to live under a hard, tough communist regime anymore. As you can see, this is a picture here of Boris Yeltsin addressing the crowd, challenging that coup, and it got Gorbachev back in power temporarily in 1991. However, Gorbachev really was dealing with a highly damaged and dysfunctional Soviet Union and couldn't keep the state together, and therefore it would implode at the end of 1991 for a range of economic, political, geopolitical and diplomatic factors.